Good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. Tonight, we're going to be talking about anxiety, stress, and behavioural issues in horses. It's a fairly broad topic, and it's certainly something I see a lot of in practice, and I'm sure something that most of you who are tuning in to this webinar have had challenges with. So whether it's a horse you've recently bought or acquired that has come to you with behavioural issues and known behavioural issues, a horse that stresses, gets quite anxious, is always fidgeting, is always shying at things, or whether it's a horse that's typically really reliable, but at times will uncharacteristically be really, really silly. We certainly know that nutrition plays a really important part, not only the actual feed we give our horses, but how we feed them. And we also know that supplements, when applied really well and selected appropriately, can play a really valuable part in helping those horses or ponies. We've probably all been there with a challenging horse and tried to address dietary and supplemental issues ourselves, whether it's starting by cutting our horse's feedback, and we may or may not notice a positive change in our horse's behaviour, and we can think we're travelling okay. So you cut your horse's feedback, and then a couple of days later it goes back to being silly again. So we go and we do a bit of Google searching or jump on a Facebook group and see what people are using to help calm their horse. Then we might try a bit of magnesium. So we add a bit of magnesium to the feed. Might work for a day or two. Maybe it makes a difference. And then we take our horse out to an event and it goes off its nuts again. So we go, well, now what do we try? We go back to, Google search or Facebook group again. And we read that chamomile flowers can be really good. So we've changed our feed, we've cut our feed amount in half, we've added magnesium, now we'll try some chamomile flowers. Horse goes really, really well for a week. So we think we're home and hosed. Then again, out of the blue, it just has a really, really bad day. So we're feeding magnesium, we've changed our feed, we've added chamomile flowers. Maybe if we increase and put more chamomile flowers in the feed, that'll help. We try that, we don't notice any difference. And it ends up being that we get to the stage where we've changed feeds, we've added supplements, we're spending a lot of money. We have, we rarely see a significant positive change, but we get to the state where we're too scared to take away all these supplements we've added. So we're frustrated, out of pocket, and really, really not sure what to do. So hopefully this webinar today or tonight will help cast some light on that. So we'll look at the reasons why our horses may exhibit behavioural issues. We will look at dietary influences, and we'll also look at some of the supplements commonly used for horses with behavioural issues, as well as things we need to be aware of when using supplements. So the potential contributors to anxiety and behavioural issues in our horses are really, really wide and varied. And I think it's really important to be aware that often it's more than one issue occurring at once. So it can be quite multifactorial, and that you really have to cross all your T's and dot all your I's to make sure you identify the reasons why your horse may be exhibiting behavioural issues. Some of the most common reasons include pain. So certainly a horse that's in discomfort has a very good reason to be exhibiting behavioural issues. Behavioural issues can become a learned behaviour. So it can become quite conditioned. A horse will get in the habit of being in a certain situation and responding with issues to help cope with that. Poor fitting equipment. Certainly one that we need to consider is our own disposition as a horse handler or rider. So there's really good research to show that when we're stressed, so when our heart rate level goes up and our cortisol level goes up, so cortisol is a stress hormone, our horse's heart rate and cortisol levels go up. So when we're stressed, our horses are too. And I think it can take a lot of self-awareness sometimes to know when we're stressed. So I think, typically it can be when we're in a hurry. So we could be running late for work, we're trying to get our kids ready for school, we've got 5 minutes to go out and feed our horse and take their rug off. Horse is usually really good when we feed and unrug it, but that day when we're in a rush and we're in a hurry, our cortisol levels are high, our heart rate's high, we rush out to our horse. That's the one day where our horse takes off down the paddock, acts like an absolute tool, usually because we're stressed and we're rushed. So I think that's a really, really important one to consider and an easy one to overlook. Also, when we're nervous, so if we're going out to a competition or event that we've trained our horse hard for, we've paid our entry fees, we've got our horse going really well and we look really good, but we're really nervous, that will rub off on our horses too. We've touched there on stress and cortisol. So cortisol is a hormone which is released in response to stress, and it puts the body in an alert state and can make horses quite hypersensitive to different situations. Social isolation. So horses are herd animals. They can very much become conditioned to being on their own and working on their own, but their natural instinct is to be around other horses, and that can certainly influence their behaviour. Workload, if a horse is overtrained, which affects its cortisol levels and other hormones and stress levels, that can certainly contribute to behavioural issues, as can if we're overfacing our horse in terms of what we're asking as a rider or handler. Hormone levels, so particularly in fillies and colts and mares, this can definitely be a consideration. The environment the horse is in, this can feed into fear, or is it a place it needs to escape from? So again, that flight response. Side effects of some medications can certainly come into part. If we look at things like clenbuterol, which is often used to help with equine asthma, or in some cases certainly used to help with breathing, that action of that drug is a central nervous system stimulant. So that speeds up a horse's heart rate. It gets them in a keyed up state. We also have indirect effects of medications. So medications which will change nutrient status of horses, as well as their gut microflora, which we'll get into in coming slides. If a horse has a true allergic reaction, it will release high amounts of histamine, and that can certainly contribute to anxious behaviour in horses. The ones we are going to focus on tonight are gastrointestinal health. So we will look at how microflora and the lining of the gut affects a horse's temperament and their mood and their behaviour. We will look at neurotransmitter production and function. So this ties quite closely into gut health. We'll look at the effects of inflammation, and we'll look at how nutrition and a diet affects our horses. So whenever I'm called in to look at a horse with behavioural issues, some of the key focuses I will look at are the state of its gastrointestinal health. I want to make sure it's on a diet which covers all its key nutritional requirements. I'll be wanting to reduce inflammation in most cases. I'll be wanting to make a healthy balance of those neurotransmitters which promote a calm, healthy, relaxed, happy horse. I'll be looking at factors which influence absorption of particular nutrients and also metabolic function, so how a horse produces some of its own nutrients. I'll be looking at addressing nutritional deficiencies and insufficiencies, so when a horse isn't getting enough of a nutrient, because that can certainly play a part in behaviour. And I'll also be looking at nutritional excesses, because although certainly nutritional insufficiencies or deficiencies can contribute to bad behaviour, certainly nutritional excesses, so too much of some key nutrients, can also influence poor behaviour. So these are things I take into consideration after going through some of those factors in the first list, and will influence the way I develop a horse's diet, the management recommendations I make, as well as nutraceuticals, so nutritional supplements and herbal medicines I may prescribe. It's really, really important when there's a consideration on my behalf that the horse could be in pain, that it has a really thorough vet examination to rule in or out any possible pain causes. Some of the horses, or a lot of the horses I've seen, have already had quite extensive veterinary diagnostics done on them. Other horses haven't. So it depends where I come in terms of treatment for that horse. But certainly ruling in or out a physical cause of pain is really, really important. On taking a multifactorial approach, it's really key to identify the reasons why that horse is having the behavioural issues and develop a treatment plan to help address those causes. If we just throw a handful of herbs or nutrients or calming supplements at a horse without properly identifying and addressing the factors why it's having behaviour issues, then the treatment will likely be limited in how effective it is. I think we often tend to focus on nutrition and supplements and diets because it's really easy in practicality and reality for us to change. It's much easier for us to go and add magnesium to a horse's feed rather than to address maybe the way we ride or buy new tack or saddle for our horse or change the setup of the environment it's kept in or even address our own stress levels. So it's something we know we can control and change relatively easily, which is why we tend to focus. But the flip side of that is nutrition certainly does play a really big and important part. So it's a good part to focus on, but don't look at it exclusively without addressing other factors. So when we look at how gastrointestinal health affects our horse's behaviour and their mood and their temperament, we want to think of the whole of the gastrointestinal system, so the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and we want to think of gastrointestinal health as being more than just the absence of ulcers. I think with our heightened awareness and ability to scope and look for ulcers and prescribe drugs to help facilitate healing of ulcers, I think it's really, really easy for us to just think that if there's no ulcers, then our horse has got good gut health. But the absence of ulcers alone doesn't necessarily mean a horse has really good gut health. So when we're looking at gut health, I want to look at how a horse is able to digest, absorb, and metabolize nutrients. So if a horse isn't able to properly digest its feed or the minerals contained in it, if they're not able to absorb it properly and metabolize it properly, then they're not going to be able to use those nutrients properly that are needed for good behavior and good health. When I talk about the epithelial integrity, so that's the cells that line the gut throughout the intestines, these can become damaged and inflamed through a host of different factors. So I always want to be looking at what we can do from a dietary management and supplementation strategy to promote really good epithelial integrity. I also want to address the microflora balance throughout a horse's gastrointestinal tract. So similar but different to humans, horses have a set of, or a population of microbes, so bacteria, fungi, archaea, but primarily bacteria, which influence their ability to absorb different nutrients. Hindgut microflora produce substances such as B group vitamins and biotin and vitamin K. They also produce anti-inflammatory substances. They influence neurotransmitter production and function, and they influence metabolic function, they influence immune function. So I always want to make sure that that population and balance of bacteria is really, really healthy. There are millions and millions of different types of bacteria, maybe not quite that many, but there are a lot. The easiest way to think of promoting healthy hindgut microflora or healthy microflora in our horses is to focus on a fibre-based diet. So to oversimplify a diet high in fibre, so your hay, your forages, things like your beet pulp, they feed healthy bacteria, the bacteria that we want to exert all those beneficial functions in our horse. Diets that are typically higher in grain, higher in starch, higher in sugars, high in omega-6 or pro-inflammatory fat, they tend to offset that healthy bacterial population to a population that is not beneficial to our horse. So neurotransmitters are chemicals which influence a lot of functions in our horses. They influence mood, temperament, behaviour, learning, motor function. When I'm looking at helping a horse with behavioural issues, depending on what that issue is, I'm generally targeting 3 key neurotransmitters, so serotonin, dopamine, or GABA. Between them, these neurotransmitters help our horses to feel calm, relaxed, happy, at ease. So I'm always looking at balancing them. Again, from a really basic standpoint, having that healthy hindgut microflora really influences neurotransmitter production and function. So we know about 80% of neurotransmitters are produced by those microflora throughout the gastrointestinal tract. Largely through those neurotransmitters, we have what's called the gut-brain axis. So the gut and the brain have a bidirectional relationship and will send messages to each other. So again, that is why it's so key to have that really, really good gut health to help promote that calm, happy, healthy horse. In terms of gastrointestinal health, we know that the gut significantly influences systemic inflammatory levels. The higher the inflammatory levels in our horse, the higher their perception to pain is, the higher their perception to stimuli is, and it also throws off that healthy balance of neurotransmitters. So again, we want to keep inflammation to a healthy minimum. In terms of some of the horses I see, particularly those with quite a history of colic or just general gastrointestinal discomfort, I'm taking into account what we call gastrointestinal visceral sensitivity or pain. So we know that when the cells lining the gut become inflamed and or there's pressure build up in the gut, so a lot of gas, those nerve endings and those cells lining the gut are really, really, really sensitive to pain. And it's not something that we can visualize or see. But again, going through a case history of a horse, going through its medication history, its diet, it's often something that I need to address. And again, particularly in those horses that have a history of repeated colics. So we sort of already covered neurotransmitter production and function. And again, the three key neurotransmitters that I hone in on, and again, it depends on the issues the horse are presenting with, primarily serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. So again, they're largely synthesized in the gut and significantly influence our horse's behavior. When I say modulate, it's important to know that a certain amount of even those calming neurotransmitters is good, but too much of them can have adverse effects too. So it's finding a really, really healthy balance with those neurotransmitters. Inflammation is a really important consideration in our horse's behavior and health. When our horse is under stress, again, and it's probably really important to emphasize that stress isn't just situational or behavioral. So certainly we can see outward signs of our horse being visibly stressed, but things like nutritional insufficiencies and deficiencies are perceived by the horse's body as a stressful state and will change cortisol levels and hormonal levels. So stress can come from many sources. It can be transporting a horse. It can be pulling a horse out of a mob of other horses and totally changing its environment. So it's important to remember that, yes, we can often see visible stress or visible signs of stress, but there are other contributing factors to stress in our horses. So going back to how inflammation feeds into that. So cortisol is a hormone that's released in response to stress. One of cortisol's functions is to help dampen inflammation, so help reduce excessive inflammation. The main issue comes when our horse is under repeated stress or constant stress. That causes what we call cortisol dysfunction. So that ability to dampen inflammation when a horse is under repeated stress is lost, which means that we've lost a key mechanism to help keep inflammation under control. We know that high levels of inflammation then change neurotransmitters. So again, changing those key chemicals which help keep our horses calm. They change nutritional requirements. So when there's a high level of inflammation, a horse will churn through some of those key nutrients needed for health and being relaxed and calm. It'll go through those at a higher rate. Stress and cortisol are also bidirectional. So if we're feeding our horse a really highly pro-inflammatory diet, that in turn can contribute to cortisol dysfunction. Changes in gut microflora, again, will have the potential to significantly increase inflammation. Again, many of those healthy bacteria produce anti-inflammatory substances. So if we have damage to gut microflora, then that's certainly a really important consideration. When our horses lose that healthy bacterial balance, the integrity, so the cells lining the gut again, become more inflamed and they lose their integrity. And then we have increased loss or poor absorption of some key minerals. Again, we get changes in neurotransmitter production and function. We need to be really, really aware that what we feed our horse significantly influences inflammation. We can, and we'll probably cover this in coming slides, but often we will put horses who need a cool feed or a calming feed. Often those feeds are really high in fat to help replace some of the starch that's taken out of those feeds. Often those fats are really high in what we call omega-6 fatty acids, which when they're fed in high levels and omega-3 levels or omega-3 fatty acids are low in our horse's diet, that sets up an inflammatory cascade. Supplements can, if they're inappropriately used, and wrong supplements can cause inflammation. So we know that iron often will cause inflammation. The majority of horses will not need iron supplementation, yet it's something I commonly see, particularly in racing stables and some endurance horses. Often it does depend on part of the world you're in and how you feed, but particularly in Australia, our soil levels of iron and our pasture levels of iron, and typically our hay, contains a lot of iron. If we then go and supplement iron on top of that really high level of iron our horses are already getting, that promotes and feeds that inflammatory cycle. Iron is probably, in my view, one of the most misused supplements in horses, and certainly if we've got a horse with behavioural issues and we're supplementing iron without knowing how much iron we're already feeding, that's a cause for concern. Overweight, or particularly over-fat horses, will have a higher level of inflammation in their body. So fat is what we call an endocrine organ, which means fat produces its own lot of hormones and inflammatory mediators. So again, a fatter horse, or a horse carrying more body fat, is going to have higher levels of inflammation than if it was in a healthy body weight and healthy body condition. So some of the really key things to keep in mind when feeding a horse, particularly one with behavioural issues, but certainly feeding a horse for overall good health, is focusing on fibre intake. At a minimum, our horses need 1.5 to 2% of their body weight in dry matter daily. That fibre is so important. We've certainly talked about it in previous webinars. So we did a webinar on EGUS and gastrointestinal health in horses and ponies. And if you haven't seen that, I strongly suggest that you do watch it. It's on both the Pets Diag and Optim Equine website. So if you haven't seen that, certainly check it out, because I don't want to go and rehash everything that we went through there. But certainly that fibre is so important to feed those healthy hindgut microflora, to produce those calming neurotransmitters, and to have a sustained energy release. It also, that fibre ensures that our horses, providing they've got that healthy hindgut microflora, are able to synthesize their own B group vitamins. And some of those B group vitamins are key for promoting a calm, healthy, happy horse. So emphasizing fibre in the diet is really important. Certainly looking at our horses' energy intake. Is it appropriate for their level of work? And not only is the energy intake appropriate, but is the feed composition providing that energy intake appropriate? We want to look at protein. It's interesting, I find in practice that if a horse is having behavioural issues, owners can be quick to pull protein out of the diet or protein sources, or blame protein as a cause of poor behaviour. It's quite hard, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it is quite hard to overfeed our horses protein. And protein provides building blocks called amino acids, which are key for the synthesis and production of some of those key calming neurotransmitters. So if we go and pull all the valuable protein, quality protein out of our horses' diet, and they're having behavioural issues, chances are we're really not helping them. with that. So we need to be looking at addressing protein needs and ensuring we've got quality protein in the diet, which covers all their essential amino acid needs. Minerals play a really, really important part in overall health for our horses, but also in helping promote calm behaviour. Again, although we want to feed a fibre-based diet alone, even on really improved and really good pastures, will fail to meet key mineral requirements for our horses. So unless we're feeding a quality fortified feed with appropriate levels of minerals in that, or we're adding a good quality mineral balancer to our horses' diet, they will fail to get those key minerals needed for good behaviour. And again, it can be quite a common scenario to see people who are struggling with a horse's behaviour. So they'll cut back their feed. Some will not feed their horse any hard feed, maybe just have them on grass or a bit of hay, and still see no or little improvement in behaviour. And one of the reasons for that is on grass or grass and hay alone, they're going to be failing to meet their protein needs and their mineral requirements for those key neurotransmitters. Additionally, sometimes these are also the horses that get fed all these different calming supplements, but are having really little, or their owners are seeing really little beneficial change. It's not that these horses need more calming supplements, it's that these horses need baseline mineral and protein levels to start with to help give the body the building blocks it needs to build those healthy neurotransmitters, to make sure that the lining of their gut is really, really healthy. Vitamins too are an important consideration. Maybe not quite as much as minerals, in that a horse with healthy hindgut microflora, they will synthesize their own B group vitamins and vitamin K. Having said that, something like vitamin D, we largely rely on sunlight on our horse's skin to produce that. And if we have our horses constantly rugged or constantly in stables, then that's generally something we need to address. Depending on pasture and hay and our horse's requirements, we may need to address vitamins A and E. But minerals are definitely quite important. It's not only what we feed to, but it's also how we feed. We want our horses to effectively be mimicking constant grazing. So if our horses aren't in a paddock or pasture situation where they can be grazing all the time, if we're feeding them hay, then we want to make that so they're consuming that slowly and throughout the day and evening, rather than getting, a big slab in the morning and nothing throughout the day, or a big slab in the evening and nothing throughout the day. If we're feeding our horse a hard feed or a concentrated feed, we want to make sure that feed size is small. If we feed our horses feeds that are too big, that feed rushes through the stomach undigested, because our horses' stomachs are really, really quite small and they don't have much of an ability to expand. So if there's too much food going in there, it passes quickly out of the stomach into the small intestines and large intestines, not absorbed properly. It will then get to the hindgut and ferment and change that healthy gut microflora. So again, it's keeping meal size small, if and when we need to feed concentrate. Nutritional deficiencies are a really important consideration for overall health too. Most of the things we talk about tonight are in relation to overall health, as well as being quite specific for a horse with behavioural issues. But there are quite a few reasons why a horse can have a nutritional deficiency. It can be that we're not providing them enough in their diet. So again, going back to the horse that might be just on pasture or pasture and hay, again, unless we're actively supplementing those key minerals and some of those key vitamins, they're not going to be getting their baseline dietary requirements. There are things which inhibit the absorption and uptake of minerals, particularly if we look at our horses who are on ulcer medications, so those based on omeprazole or ranitidine, but particularly our omeprazole-based ones, the most common ones we use, and whether that's injectable or oral, they will influence a horse's ability to properly digest and absorb key minerals. And key minerals like calcium, magnesium, zinc, all which have a key role not only in overall health, but producing those calm, happy, healthy neurotransmitters. When we're thinking about B group vitamins, and some of those, well, B group vitamins and vitamin K, but thinking in terms of behavioural wise, B group vitamins, our horse can become deficient in those or have insufficient levels if that microflora throughout the gastrointestinal tract, and particularly the hindgut, is out of whack. So if that's not in balance, then they are unable to produce those B group vitamins and vitamin K to the level that they need. Some horses will have increased losses of some minerals, so some common medications used, depending on which part of the world you're in and what breed of horse and what discipline you're using will influence that. But things like 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬, furosemide, that drug particularly increases nutrient loss, and particularly our minerals. There are plenty of other drugs too that influence nutrient uptake, so things like corticosteroids will affect magnesium levels. But there's certainly a lot of different drugs out there that do influence nutrient excretion. Antibiotics and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, so things like phenylbutazone, which we know as bute, flunix, phenamine, by affecting the hindgut microflora, they essentially kill off or damage those microflora. They damage those healthy ones, so the ones that we need to synthesize and produce those key B group vitamins. So certainly that's another way how medications can indirectly influence our horse's health and temperament, but also result in nutritional deficiencies or insufficiencies. There are times in a horse's life where they'll have increased requirements of certain nutrients. If they've been sick, whether that be a viral infection, a bacterial infection, whether they're under times of heightened stress, so heavy training loads or constant changes of environment, particularly things like yearling sales, where they're transported from a stud, they've done a yearling prep, they go to a sale, they then go to a new home. Times of increased growth, so weanlings, yearlings, rapid growth stages. Post-surgery and with injury, horses will have increased requirements. And if we're not giving them the sufficient building blocks to meet those requirements, then they need to draw upon their body stores, which again will leave them in a state of nutritional insufficiency or deficiency. Another consideration is heavy metals, so things like nickel, lead, aluminium. They will inhibit the absorption of some minerals, so they will bind to receptor sites where some minerals need to be absorbed. So again, heavy metals can inadvertently cause nutritional deficiencies, even if you're feeding your horse recommended levels of those minerals. If they've got a high heavy metal burden, then they won't be able to properly absorb and utilize those key nutrients. On the other hand, we've got nutritional excesses too. So we've got not enough nutrients can influence behavior. We've got too much of some nutrients can. I've put energy there, and I've put a question mark in that, yes, we can certainly overfeed our horses and they can be full of energy, but we can also overfeed our horses and they can be docile. I don't always like to draw correlations to people, but if you think about us, we can sit here stuffing our faces with far more energy than we need, and it doesn't mean that we're going to jump out of the couch and be hyperactive and run around. So it's certainly a consideration, but I wouldn't say it's relative to all cases. Having said that, if the diet is really high in starch and or the feed sizes are really big and our horse isn't digesting that properly, then yes, it can certainly contribute to poor behaviour, particularly by influencing that hindgut microflora and pro-inflammatory mediators. So when we talk about starch, we think particularly of our grains and particularly uncooked grains. Of all the grains, so whether we're thinking oats, rye, barley, triticale, corn, of all the grains, corn is the most poorly digested grain. And in my opinion, there's really no place for corn in a horse's diet. Even cracked corn passes largely undigested straight into the hindgut and changes that whole hindgut microflora. So definitely something to keep in mind. Omega-6 fatty acids. So again, going back to that balance of omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids tend to be found in high levels in vegetable oils and high-fat feeds. And again, often these high-fat feeds are those that are promoted as being calm and cooling and for our horses. But it's really, really easy to feed our horses proportionally far too much omega-6s, which will drive inflammation. Oxidized or rancid fats and oils. So again, if you feed your horse any form of oil added to their feed, and a lot of us do as an energy source or as a calorie source, and or to help a horse's coat, if that oil has been stored in a large container that's see-through or clear, or even if it's a large container and you've opened that container more than 2 or 3 weeks ago, and or if the container is stored with the lid off or somewhere warm, that oil begins to become what we call oxidized, and it degrades and it'll become rancid, and it has already started oxidizing before it smells off. You go, oil smells okay, give it to our horses. Chances are, if it's been open for more than a couple of weeks, and or it's been stored in a see-through container, so your plastic containers that you get from the supermarket, and or the lid's been left off, and or it's been kept in the sun, that oil goes really rancid quickly. And as soon as an oil becomes rancid, it becomes pro-inflammatory. So again, it feeds into that whole inflammatory process. The other nutritional excess, which we've already touched on previously, was iron. Again, that list is by no means conclusive, but it's just what I tend to commonly see in practice. So if we've got this horse that's hyped up, that shies at everything, that is just being an absolute tool, what are some of the key nutrients we need to consider? So these are typically things I'll think about, but it largely depends on a horse's overall diet. It depends on the factors contributing to its behaviour. So again, going back to that list we went through at the very, very start, it'll depend on any illness or injury that horse has had, if it's on any medications or has recently been on any medications. But I'll certainly think of magnesium. I'll think of B group vitamins, and I'll definitely think about addressing why their B group level vitamins are poor, which means I'll be addressing hindgut health and microflora. Zinc is a key consideration. Protein, so again, going back to where it can be quite common to cut out protein or quality sources of protein and amino acids in our horse's diet. Protein is a really, really important consideration. Sodium, so salt, believe it or not, can certainly influence a horse's behaviour, and it's really easy for us to forget to add salt to our horse's feeds. Selenium, and this is a nutrient we need to be really, really careful with, in that we can overdose easily, and the signs of selenium insufficiency or deficiency are the same as selenium excess. And omega-3 fatty acids. Again, just remember, it's really important to be aware that there are a lot of things that can influence nutrient requirements and a horse's need for supplementation or addressing those nutrients. So obviously their overall base diet, but levels of inflammation in the body, any health concerns they have, again, any medications that they're on or have been on recently, what's going on for that horse's overall health, the workload they're under, their life stage and growth stage too. And I can't emphasize enough that it's really, really important to keep in mind that excesses of some nutrients can be just as harmful, if not more so, than deficiencies or insufficiencies of nutrients. So it's certainly not a more is better case. And that's something really to keep in mind whenever we're supplementing. So what about grain-free or low-starch diets? We're looking at diets that are typically fed to a horse that's exhibiting behavioural issues. As we talked about with corn, grains and starch are harder to digest, and corn is probably the worst, well, it isn't probably, it is the worst candidate in terms of grains, in that it will pass through the stomach quickly into the small intestine and large intestine, and it's not digested properly. When it ends up in the large intestines, it's fermented by the microflora there, and the microflora in a horse's hindgut changes according to what it's fed. Now, if we're feeding it fibre, fibre is the one thing that we want the hindgut microflora to ferment, and it's really beneficial for them to do that. It is not beneficial for them to ferment grains. It is certainly not beneficial for them to ferment starch and corn, and that will change the gut microflora population. So it'll change it to those ones that we don't want, the unhealthy ones, unhealthy for want of a better term, the ones that set up inflammation, the ones that change those neurotransmitters. So that's really, really important to remember. Low starch feeds are marketed really, really well. So yes, we want to feed our horse low starch, particularly one with behavioural issues. But there's loopholes in how grain-free or low starch feeds are advertised, and particularly in Australia. So a horse can be fed a grain-free or low starch feed, but that can contain things like meal run, meal mix, which they're commonly called, which are grain byproducts. So although it may not have the whole physical grain in it, it still contains grain byproducts, which doesn't necessarily mean it's grain-free or low starch. So that's really important to keep in mind. It'll typically be listed as meal run or meal mix in a feed label. The other thing to keep in mind, again, these low grain or low starch feeds are commonly quite high in omega-6 fatty acids, in that to provide energy in that feed, the grain needs to be replaced with something. So it's typically replaced with oil, and it's typically a high omega-6 oil. The two, the high omega-6 content and high meal mix or meal run are not true on every single feed in the market. So there are certainly feeds out there that get it right, but there are really high percentage that include those ingredients. And that's something to be really aware of. And again, it can be one of the many, many reasons why, if you change your horse to a grain-free diet and it's getting mineral requirements met, that can be one of the reasons why that change of feed has had no or very little positive difference for your horse. The other thing to keep in mind about grain-free diets or low starch diets, higher grain diets, is that, I'm just, going on low starch made me think about it, is if your horse is on ulcer medication, so again, the omeprazole, the ranitidine, that inhibits the initial stages of digestion. It's more in relation to proteins, but again, some of those key enzymes needed to facilitate digestion, and the pH needed, which will influence the whole digestive tract, is changed. So it's just worth keeping in mind the effects of those medications too. So what about spring grass or autumn grass or fall grass? Lush green grass. That certainly can affect behaviour. And there are a few key mechanisms on how it can. So when our horses have a lot of grass, it's easy for us to think, well, they don't need hay anymore, they don't need hard feed anymore. So again, in terms of if we take that hay away, we've lost a really good source of fibre for our horses. So grass is predominantly water and really, really low fibre. Hay is the flip, it's really high fibre, really, really low water. Those healthy hindgut microflora, again, remembering that they produce key anti-inflammatory substrates. They influence those neurotransmitters, particularly those ones that make a healthy, calm horse, as well as that bacterial microflora. If we take that hay away and just rely on spring grass, we've lost a really, really high percentage of fibre in our horse's diet. So that's one of the key considerations. Second one, again, is we'll often stop hard feeding our horses, and particularly if they're on a fortified feed or a balancer, which provides some of those key minerals, we've just taken away that source for them. The other thing is some of our grasses, particularly our clovers, our ryegrasses, more so rye than other grasses, but they can be really high in sugars and really high in a certain type of sugar called fructose. Our horses aren't able to properly break down, digest, and absorb fructose, and fructose will cause a whole major shift of microflora in the hindgut. So again, you can have quite a bit of fresh grass, and the sugar in that can affect the horse per se. Probably the biggest consideration is magnesium and potassium. So fresh grass, being green grass, is high in potassium. potassium and magnesium compete for the same absorption receptor sites. So if they've got a whole heap of potassium, remember the more green grass they have, the more potassium they're getting. That will in turn reduce the absorption of magnesium, and it will also increase the excretion of magnesium, which is quite ironic. So they're not able to absorb it that well, and what they're absorbing, they excrete more quickly. We know that magnesium plays many essential roles in terms of helping promote a calm, healthy horse. So it breaks down another key neurotransmitter called 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬. 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬 helps make our horse excitable and on edge, and it's a neuromuscular excitatory neurotransmitter. So again, if our horses aren't able to produce the enzyme which helps break and degrade that 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬 down, then that can be another contributing factor. We also know that magnesium plays a key role in influencing parathyroid hormone production and some of the enzymes around that, which again can influence behaviour. Magnesium is also needed to do what we call phosphorylate vitamin B1. So vitamin B1 is typically produced in a form called thiamine, and it needs magnesium to convert it to a bioavailable and active thiamine pyrophosphate. So again, magnesium and B1 play quite an interrelated role there. Which brings us to calming supplements. So, do they work? What role do they play? And how do nutrients and herbs fit into the scope of things? Firstly, it's really, really important to note that herbs in and of themselves won't correct nutritional deficiencies or insufficiencies. So if our horse is lacking in magnesium or zinc or calcium or phosphorus, copper, anything like that, herbs won't in and of themselves correct that. So herbs, by and large, tend to act more like drugs, but don't tend to be a great source of nutrients. So if you think, oh, I'm feeding my horse on a grass diet or grass and hay diet, but I'm feeding him some herbs, it'll cover his nutritional requirements. They won't. And it can be quite alarming to see the number of natural supplements on the market that claim to be all your horse needs in addition to their hay or their feed, but they by and large fall well short of a horse's key nutritional requirements. So just always keep that in mind, that you might be giving your horse supplements in addition to their hay or their pasture or an unfortified feed, but if those supplements are primarily herb-based, chances are they're not meeting your horse's basic nutritional requirements. A slight aside on that is if a horse has really poor digestive health and digestive function, and I'm looking at herbs to use to repair and enhance digestive health, then indirectly they can help a horse's mineral status and nutritional status improve, providing those nutrients are coming into the diet. But herbs in and of themselves aren't good sources of minerals per se. Again, so when I'm using herbal medicines, I tend to view them more like a drug, more like a pharmaceutical in their actions and applications. And certainly I don't view them as a nutritional source. Whenever we're talking about herbal treatment in a horse too, we need to be really, really aware that there are a lot of things that we need to take into account. So depending on the country you're in, but by and large, there tends to be very little regulation around the sale of herbs and herbal supplements. Whether we use a dried herb or a liquid herb influences how effective that herb or herbal medicine is. If we're using a liquid, the strength of that liquid and how it's extracted, whether it's an ethanol-based or a glycerol-based, certainly influences the active constituents it contains and its ability to exert beneficial effects. We need to consider the strength of it. Herbs are also commonly adulterated. So what that means is we may think we're giving a horse Panax ginseng, being one of the most expensive herbs there is, but that is typically substituted with a herb that's definitely not Panax ginseng. So whenever I use herbal medicines, I'm very, very strict in that I'll use TGA registered, which in Australia is the Therapeutic Goods Association, liquid herbs, ethanol based, that are human grade, in that they are the only guaranteed regulated herbs that are available that we know meet strict requirements. And those herbs, you must be a registered practitioner to prescribe, and they must be prescribed on an individual basis. So herbs that meet those criteria can't be sold as a pre-formulated mix for anyone to buy. So if you're seeing herbal products on the market that are claiming to be really good, particularly this is in Australia with Australian legalities, your chances of them being guaranteed that they meet strict requirements are highly unlikely, given that to meet those strict requirements, they have to be a TGA registered good, and TGA registered goods can't be sold without a consultation and prescription. So always be really aware with that in terms of herbs, and in terms of herbal medicines too, be aware of swabbing restrictions in some disciplines. Keeping in mind that if you're not using a prescribed product, you don't necessarily know that you're getting what you think you're getting. In terms of calming supplements, they can be really, really useful if the cause of your horse's issues have been properly identified and those herbs or nutrients are used to target those causes. Again, just throwing herbs and nutrients at a horse because they're associated with calming or being good for our horses will be limited in being beneficial at best. So some of the most commonly used calming nutrients available for our horses are magnesium, which we touched on before. Something that I think is really important to emphasize with magnesium is that there are many, many, many different forms of magnesium depending on what that magnesium is bound to. So commonly people will use magnesium sulfate or magnesium oxide in that they're widely available and they're cheap. Those forms of magnesium have what we call poor bioavailability, meaning our horses aren't able to readily digest and absorb and utilize those forms of magnesium. Having said that, if you've got a horse that's really, really, really magnesium deficient, they will uptake a percentage of that. But if we're really looking at increasing magnesium levels, we definitely want to use a highly bioavailable form. We need to keep in mind that with sulfate and oxide forms of magnesium, they can be a gastric irritant and have a laxative effect or make our horses' manure quite loose. So again, knowing how intimately gut health and gut sensitivity is in terms of our horses' behaviour, if we're giving them really high doses or decent amounts of those forms of magnesium, we can really upset their guts, which can just contribute to the whole issue that we're trying to deal with. I do certainly like magnesium in many cases. I just get very concerned in that often we use it inappropriately. We also need to be really, really aware with magnesium, particularly if we're giving it in high doses and or we're giving it for a long period of time, is that it competes with other key minerals for uptake. So things like calcium, phosphorus and zinc. We know calcium and phosphorus have their roles to play in helping produce those calming neurotransmitters. So giving a horse a whole heap of magnesium for long periods of time or really high dose, we really need to be quite aware of that. In terms of B1, so again, if we've got our horses' hindgut microflora in a really good state, they should be producing good levels of B1 themselves. If we use B1 as a single supplement, it can be of limited value in that we know that B group vitamins tend to like to hang out together. So B1, B3, B5, B6, folate, B12. They tend to do their best work in conjunction. So just giving one single B vitamin without its buddies to hang out with can be quite limited in terms of how effective it can be. Typically, B1 in a lot of supplements the dose of it is actually really, really low. So that's another consideration to take into account, that just because a product contains a nutrient or a herb doesn't mean it's in sufficient quantities to do a whole lot of good. The other thing is, again, it's all, you know, commonly added to a supplement in the form of thiamine, which is not biologically active. So unless it's converted to thiamine pyrophosphate, it's a quite limited use. Ironically, excess B1 supplementation can deplete magnesium levels too. So again, we know magnesium is really important to help with GABA production and help our horses be calm. But if we go and give a whole heap of B1, not enough magnesium, then we can really throw things out of whack. The other supplement, which is quite common that you'll see in a lot of calming supplements, is the amino acid tryptophan. So we know that there's good evidence in some cases that it can be helpful for humans to help with calming, in that tryptophan is a key amino acid, which is a precursor to serotonin. So serotonin being one of those neurotransmitters that help keep our horse happy and calm. We know that tryptophan plays an important role with that. Having said that, this is a really good case where current research in humans and horses is shown to be quite different. So the current research with tryptophan in horses show that low doses of supplemental tryptophan actually makes excitability in horses worse. So if you've got an edgy, nervy, you know, horse that's really go, giving it tryptophan in the amount that's commonly contained in supplements can actually make the horse's behaviour worse. If it's given in high doses, we know that it can cause hemolytic anemia. So that's the premature breakdown of red blood cells, and it reduces endurance capacity. So certainly things we don't want to do. I don't use tryptophan. I never have, and I would be really, really cautious of any supplement that contains it. Furthermore to that, going around or knowing that most nutrients work best in conjunction with other nutrients, for tryptophan to be able to get to serotonin in the first place, it's got to go through several metabolic phases. There are enzymes in parts of those phases for it to get from tryptophan to serotonin, and those enzymes depend on magnesium, calcium, B6, B9, iron, zinc, vitamin C, niacin, B12. So again, if we just go and give one nutrient in isolation without addressing other nutrient requirements, it can be really limited in how effective it is. And in the case of tryptophan, where current research is at with horses, it can actually make our horses worse behaved. Definitely not something you want to do if you're struggling with our horse's behaviour. It's worth touching on a couple of the more commonly used herbal medicines or herbs used in horses with behavioural issues. Chamomile and valerian are two of the most commonly used ones. Going back to what I said about the forms of herbs we use, we need to realise that herbs in their dried form are actually generally really low in active constituents. So the parts of the herbs that have the effects that we want them to do. So again, feeding, you know, a Galloway or a hack a cup of chamomile flowers is really unlikely to have any significant effect. We need to be aware with whatever herb we're using that we know the part of the herb we're using. So if we're using chamomile, we're going to use the flower. If we're using valerian, we're going to use the root. It's not always the case that when people are using a herb that they're aware of the part they're using. So that's important to keep in mind. In terms of chamomile too, I would just be aware that a horse, not all the time, but a horse that tends to have potential for an allergic reaction, I'd be really quite cautious in its use. Is a member of the Asteraceae family, and in some susceptible horses, that have an allergic tendency, not all of them, but some, it's a herb you need to give consideration to. Again, as an overview with herbs, be aware that substitutive species or adoration of herbs is quite common. Unlikely with chamomile, given it can tend to be a cheaper herb or a more widely available herb. and unlikely with valerian, but certainly with any herbal product, it can be really hit and miss if you're getting what you actually think you're getting, unless it's produced under strict guidelines. In terms of valerian, if it is actually valerian you're using, it contains valerianic acid, which is a controlled substance under FEI rules. So again, be aware that herbs have the potential to produce a positive swab, depending on your discipline, depending on the amount of herb used, depending on the form of the herb used. Again, keep in mind that chamomile, valerian, or any other herb won't address nutritional deficiencies or insufficiencies. Both chamomile and valerian can be great in helping regulate GABA and serotonin levels. So again, helping those calming, nice, steady neurotransmitters. Valerian can have a really nice antispasmodic effect on the gastrointestinal system. So if you've got a horse that part of their behavioural picture is issues with gut motility and heightened gut sensitivity, it can be really, really good. Chamomile can be similar in those actions too. We know that chamomile has an anti-inflammatory effect on the gut. So again, it can be really useful in that aspect. But it's horses for courses and herbs for horses. It's knowing their application, how it's indicated for your horse, and applying it as such. So what do you do when diet and supplements don't work? You need to consider if the amount, the dosage amount you've used of that supplement is appropriate and enough to exert a therapeutic effect. So again, it's really common for many supplements on the market to claim they contain ingredients, and some of them good ingredients, but have them in so low amounts that they have no real significant effect on our horses. So we can have great supplements, but if we don't give them in appropriate quantities, then they can be pretty much useless. We need to consider the form. So is the supplement in a highly bioavailable form? We also need to consider excipients. So these are substances which are bulkers or fillers, or if it's a powder, helps make the powder smooth, and anti-K can flow. So again, our horses can react to some of those excipients in a product, or the excipients can make up the vast majority of the product, and the actual ingredient in a product can be really quite low. We want to make sure the supplement we're using is a quality supplement produced under strict regulation, and that we know we're getting what we think we're getting. In terms of nutrients, it's really important when we're supplementing nutrients to be aware that although something like magnesium might be well indicated, or a B group vitamin might be well indicated, these nutrients, and the majority of nutrients, don't work alone. They like friends, they like family members, they like buddies to hang out with. So if we go and prescribe a single nutrient without addressing the cofactors it needs, or those other nutrients that helps it work at its best, then it can be really limited in how effective it is. We need to consider factors that will inhibit nutrient uptake, particularly herbal medicine to a degree, if you're using that. So thinking about things like our ulcer medications, particularly thinking like things if we're feeding a charcoal supplement or a clay supplement, things like that, things which inhibit our horse's ability to uptake minerals, things like heavy metal loads. So again, you can be pouring the best quality supplements in appropriate doses in your horse. If your horse can't properly digest, absorb, and metabolize that nutrient or that herb, then it's of really limited value. We need to be aware when a herb or nutrient is indicated for a horse, but also when it's contraindicated. So there are certainly some nutrients, or herbs, more likely, that you wouldn't use in pregnant mares. Depending on medications, if your horse is on any pharmaceutical medications, there are definitely herbs and nutrients that you wouldn't prescribe or use at certain times. On the flip side, there are some herbs or nutrients that are really beneficial to use alongside some common medications and will help to a certain degree to offset some of those side effects. We need to think of interactions, both positive and negative. Again, that's largely in terms of medications that are used, but also different nutrients can interact with different nutrients, both positively or negatively. Different herbs can interact with different herbs, both positively and negatively. So taking that into account. whenever we use a herb or nutrient or a supplement, we need to use it for an appropriate timeline. So it's knowing that whatever that supplement is, or that herb is, or that nutrient is, that we give it for not too short a period of time and not too long a period of time. Now, that time frame of appropriate use will depend on a lot of factors, individual to that horse and its diet and what's going on with its health. So it's easy to give a nutrient, not give it for long enough, and say it didn't work. On the other hand, it's easy to give a nutrient, give it for too long, even if it's a nutrient that works really well. And again, something that comes to mind straight away is magnesium. Horses that are kept on really high doses of magnesium constantly without suitably addressing factors, why they need it, or addressing other dietary factors if it is indicated that that horse needs to stay on magnesium. But again, we can have a nutrient that's really, really good and really useful, and if we give it for too long, we can in essence create other problems. When using our herbs and nutrients, we want to know the purpose for its use. So again, it's going back to what we talked about at the start, identifying the factors which are contributing to your horse's behavioural issues, developing a treatment strategy, so treatment aims from that, and making sure that herb, that nutrient, that supplement, that dietary change is meeting at least one, if not multiple, of those treatment aims. If a herb or nutrient or supplement or dietary change has no purpose for use, we've got to ask ourselves why we're doing it. Always remember that oral supplementation, so any feed, nutrient, herb that goes down a horse's throat, is only going to be as good as a horse's digestive system. So if your horse can't digest it, absorb it, metabolize it, it's of really little use. On that too, it's really difficult to out-supplement poor dietary and management practices. So again, you can throw really good nutrients and herbs and supplements at a horse, but if you're not taking care of the basics, like a fiber, forage-based diet, then the efficacy of those supplements is going to be short-lived or is going to be limited. In that, again, just looking at the role of fiber and hindgut microflora alone, its effect on neurotransmitter production and function, its effect on inflammation, things like that. Supplements are brilliant when used appropriately, but don't get in the habit of thinking you can out-supplement poor dietary or management practices. So putting this into practice, to supplement effectively and to have sound dietary practice for our horse. Remember, a horse with behavioural issues, you want to identify and address the causes of its behaviour. You want to implement sound dietary basics. So again, not trying to out-supplement key basic dietary requirements. And on that, remember that you can't out-supplement underwork, poor training, or rider mismatch too, or rider handler mismatch too. So that's an important consideration. Remember that a lot of supplements on the market have really dubious quality. And remember, products are marketed and designed to be sold to us. There are many things that a supplement company can say, like a supplement contains a certain ingredient, and that's no lie, but they don't tell us that it's in such a small amount that it's not really going to have an effect on our horse. Going back to a person's stress levels at the start, our cortisol levels and our heart rate levels, I think it's really important for us to remember that we can give our horse a whole heap of supplements and in our head think we're doing brilliantly. Whether or not we are might be a different matter, but if we think our horse is doing well or we're giving it the supplements it needs, chances are we're going to be calmer. If we're calmer, our cortisol levels are going to be down, our heart rate levels are going to be down. So if we think, oh, you know, I've got my horse on magnesium, it's on a calmer, he's on activated charcoal, he's on a grain-free diet, I've cut his feed in half, he'll be fine. If we're calmer, chances are our horse will be too. So even though the supplements per se or dietary changes per se aren't exerting any effect, the fact that we're calmer and more relaxed and think our pony is going to be fine will have a positive effect. So don't forget that placebo effect. And when you do supplement, use strategic supplementation. So have a purpose for it, know what you're using, know how long you're using it for, know a suitable dose range. Get those dietary basics right before you go throwing supplements at a horse. And remember that good gastrointestinal health is absolutely critical. So again, if you haven't seen that EGAS and digestive health seminar, make sure you check it out, because there's a lot that will overlap between these two, and a lot that can really, really help that horse with behavioural issues. So, thank you very much. And if anyone's got any questions, then feel free to type them in the box and I'll see if I can answer. Lucinda, it's 1.5 to 2% of dry matter per body weight in terms of fibre. So 1.5 to 2% minimum. Thank you very much for those comments too. Thank you, Camilla. Different spelling of Camilla, but another Camilla. Give it a minute or two more. Certainly, if there's any questions following on from the webinar, feel free to either email me, my email's there, or you can certainly jump on the website. So my website, optimequine.com, certainly has quite a few articles about behavioural issues, about different nutrients and herbs and things we discussed today. So. Someone's just typing a message, so I'll wait for it to come through before we go. Listen, magnesium is a really, really good one, and I don't recommend across the board, in that we will have different forms which act on different neurotransmitters, different forms in relation to a horse's state of metabolic health and the workload it's got. So rather than saying what I do use, given that it's situational, I'd certainly say what I don't, and I'd go a very wide berth on magnesium oxide and magnesium sulfate. But the other two, the other magnesiums I'll use are situational dependent. Thank you very much. So thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and look forward to seeing you next time.